After years of sacrifice raising his daughter alone, the father hears her say to his grandson, "When that useless old man dies, all of this will be ours." George was born in a house marked by hardship. The son of simple workers, he learned from an early age that everything came with effort. Nothing was given. Everything had to be earned through sweat. His childhood was filled with privations, and when he became a teenager, he started working as a mechanic's assistant. Every day, he got his hands dirty with grease, spent hours between engines and tools, and returned home tired, but never without hope. Even without saying it aloud, he dreamed of a greater life, a future where he could offer more to himself. When he became a father, reality became even heavier. The woman he loved died shortly after childbirth, and all the responsibility of raising their daughter, Carol, fell on him. He had no time to mourn. Life went on, hard as ever. There were days when they barely had dinner, and the girls' clothes came from donations or were sewn by him. Still, he never let the essentials be lacking: love, protection, and principles. Carol grew up with a present father who, even exhausted, invented bedtime stories created among the tools in the workshop. Over time, George saved money little by little. Every penny was saved with discipline. After much effort, he managed to open his own workshop. He started in a rented garage, small but enough to show his work. He was known for being honest and efficient. Because of this, the business grew. He hired employees, moved to a bigger space, and became a respected entrepreneur. Life improved. For the first time, he could give his daughter what she wanted: new clothes, good courses, trips. He thought he was compensating for the difficult years, trying to balance the past hardships. But unknowingly, he was nurturing in her the idea that the world owed her something. Carol changed. She began to see her father as outdated. She forgot the difficulties they had faced together, the days of hunger, the overdue bills. The new life brought vanity, and humility became an inconvenience. George tried to reverse this. He talked about gratitude, about the importance of roots, about how money was a tool, not a virtue. But the more he spoke, the more she distanced herself. She began treating him with disdain, as if the man with dirty hands was unworthy of the house he had built. As an adult, Carol became pregnant early from a fleeting relationship. The child's father disappeared before even knowing the result of the test. Once again, George took on the responsibility. He raised his grandson, Ryan, with the same effort he had raised his daughter. He tried to do everything right, as if this was a second chance. But Carol, filled with resentment, treated the boy with the same coldness she treated her father. She passed on to him the distorted view that the grandfather was a burden. Ryan grew up spoiled, impatient, and lacking empathy. He absorbed the contempt he saw at home. And George, nonetheless, stood firm. He continued to offer everything: home, food, advice. His pain was silent. He knew he was seen as a burden, but still, he remained. As the years went by, even with the growing distance from his daughter and the silent contempt growing within his own home, George never allowed anger to take root in his heart. There was in him an ancient peace, firm, built over a lifetime of sacrifices and disappointments. His heart, though wounded, did not know evil. He kept doing what he had always done, taking care. He put food on the table, kept the house in order, paid the bills, and even when Carol and Ryan no longer saw him as part of the family, he kept offering advice, even knowing it would not be heard. His presence was ignored most of the time, but he never stopped being there. His sadness was continuous, contained, silent. He died slowly inside, every day, little by little, without anyone noticing. One night, while coming back from the backyard, he stopped upon hearing voices coming from the living room. The television was off, and the tone of conversation was low but distinct. He recognized his daughter's voice, with that restrained coldness he had learned to fear. She was talking to Ryan, the grandson he had raised as his son. George stopped, making no sound, listening only by reflex, not imagining what was to come. "When that useless old man dies, all this will be ours," Carol said, in a dry, direct tone. Ryan let out a short laugh. "Do you think it will take long? He can barely climb the stairs anymore." "I hope not," said Carol. "He's just taking up space. The house, the workshop, the money, all that should be ours by now." George didn't move. There was no shock, no anger. Only a profound silence descended inside him like a dense, firm weight, something familiar. Those words weren't a surprise. They were just the confirmation of what had lived inside him for a long time. He wasn't loved. He was only tolerated while alive. A polite nuisance, invisible until he stopped breathing. A disposable old man. He turned and slowly returned to his room, his steps heavy. He sat on the edge of the bed, looked at his hands marked by decades of work, and took a deep breath. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply felt the weight of something he had known but had never heard so clearly. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay there, but his body wouldn't rest. He stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. He thought of the little daughter he used to rock with stories invented in the workshop, of the grandson he carried in his arms, of the times he had forgotten himself to give everything to her. He replayed every choice, every sacrifice, and no matter how hard he searched for an answer, everything seemed to dissolve into the same question. When did the love he gave turn into contempt? The night passed slowly, and when the day began to dawn, he already knew. He wouldn't argue, he wouldn't demand, he wouldn't mention what he had heard. He had simply made a decision. He needed some time to think and rest, and he knew exactly where he could do that. So he got up and made coffee as he always did. Carol didn't come downstairs, and neither did Ryan. He didn't find it strange. He went to his room, grabbed a small suitcase, packed some clothes, his medications, and an old, worn-out book. He left the room neat, the bed made, just as he always did. As he was leaving, he crossed paths with his daughter in the hallway. "Are you leaving?" Carol asked, glancing quickly. "Yes, I need some time," George said simply. She didn't answer. She went back to her phone, not caring. Ryan didn't even show up. George didn't look back. After several hours of traveling on slow, uncomfortable buses, as he chose to go this way, to observe the scenery calmly and think about everything he had heard, without hurry, without the obligation to drive, he got off on a dirt road, surrounded by dry trees and old fences. He walked a little further until he reached the farm of an old friend, Paul. A man with a calm voice, skin tanned by the sun, and hands large like his own. George approached the gate, and before knocking, he heard the familiar voice. "Took you a while, but you came," Paul said, coming out from the porch with a hat in his hands. George smiled, tired. It was about time. "It's always been," Paul said, opening the gate. "Come in. We still have coffee and shade here." They sat on the porch. The smell of earth and bushes filled the air. George stayed silent for a while, looking at the horizon. Paul waited, without hurry. "Do you remember my daughter, Carol?" "Of course. How could I not? And your grandson, the one you raised." George sighed. "They're there. I'm the one who's not anymore." Paul furrowed his brow. "What happened?" George told him everything from the point where life began to change. He talked about when the workshop started to grow, about the comfort that came with time, and how he began giving everything to Carol. He explained how he thought he was compensating for the difficult years, but, unknowingly, was cultivating in her a sense of entitlement. He told how she changed, distanced herself, and how Ryan grew up learning to ignore him just as easily as he asked for things. Finally, he talked about the night in the hallway, the cold words of his daughter, the laugh of his grandson, and the silence he chose to keep. Paul didn't interrupt, He let his friend speak everything. When George finished, his eyes were moist, but his voice still firm. "I didn't get angry, I just got tired." Paul shook his head slowly. "Some people only learn after they lose. And some people never do," George said. Paul stayed silent for a moment. He just looked at the field ahead, his eyes half closed against the evening light. George waited without hurry. He felt that in this place time followed a different rhythm, gentler. Finally, Paul turned and, with a low, firm voice, said, "You did what you had to do, George, but now it's time to rest a little. Stay here. Time passes slower here, and maybe that's what you need." George nodded. The decision was already made. He felt that this place, with the smell of wet earth, the distant crowing of roosters and the clean breeze, would be the right ground to reorganize his thoughts and let his heart breathe. And there, in the days that followed, he met James. The young man appeared early the next morning. He came barefoot, with his pants rolled up to his calves, carrying a hoe on his shoulder and a sweaty face. He had a simple, direct smile, the kind of smile that hides nothing and also asks for nothing in return. He greeted George with a respectful nod. "Are you Paul's friend?" James said, approaching slowly. "I am," George said, watching the young man carefully. "George." "James," the young man said, shaking his hand firmly. "If you need anything around here, just ask." That gesture, so ordinary, carried a weight George hadn't expected. It was just a greeting, but with it came something rare, respect without obligation. In the following days, they started meeting more. James worked all over the farm. He cleaned stables, fixed fences, took care of animals. He was quick, but not in a hurry. He did everything with the calm of someone who understands that life needs patience. George enjoyed watching. He sat on the porch and followed the rhythm of the young man, who even after hours of work still found time to help a neighbor or share a piece of bread with whoever showed up. One day, George remarked, "You help a lot of people, James." "We don't take anything from here, right?" James said, shrugging. "If I can leave something good on the way, it's worth it." The answer kept ringing in George's head. It was simple, like everything in this place, but full of truth. Over time, they started working together. James invited him to fix fences, clean tools, sort seeds, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to share moments. And George, who hadn't felt useful to anyone in a long time, found joy in being part of things again. "Have you worked with the earth before?" James asked one day as they were planting seedlings. "I've worked with so many things I lost count," George said, smiling for the first time in a long time. "But with the earth, it's different, right? It responds. If you take care of it, it gives back." George nodded. There was something there he recognized. The earth was like character. If treated with effort and truth, it gave fruit. They also began to talk more. James wanted to hear stories. He would sit next to George after dinner, his feet in the dirt, and ask about the workshop, about the old cars, about how it was to fix something from scratch. "And when did you decide to open the workshop?" "When I saw my salary couldn't even cover the basics. Either I took the risk or I stayed stuck." "Were you scared?" "Every day. But I kept going anyway." James listened for real. He didn't interrupt, didn't look away. He was the opposite of Carol and Ryan. There was no judgment, only sincere curiosity. Over time, the relationship that began with respect turned into something more. George began to see him as a grandson, not by blood, but by soul. A grandson like he had always dreamed of having. "Do you have family around here?" George asked one day. James lowered his gaze for a moment before answering. "I did. My parents died in a truck accident when I was still a boy. We lived in a small house by a river. After they passed, I went to live with an uncle, but he drank too much and was hardly ever home. I left there when I was about 15. Since then, I've been going from place to place, working wherever I could, sleeping in dorms, sometimes in barns, sometimes on the kitchen floor of good people. Here, they took me in. Paul gave me a chance, and I'm trying to make it count." George listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the young man's face. "You're worth much more than you think, James." The young man smiled, a bit embarrassed, but that touched him. George saw it. He began to care about his future. He wanted to see him grow, study, have more than just the land under his feet. He knew that James dreamed of having a small piece of land for himself, a place where he could plant and build his life calmly. He also wanted to study, to learn more about farming, about new techniques. He talked about these things with a sparkle in his eyes, but never asked for help. He only mentioned it when asked, as if he didn't want to seem ungrateful for everything he had already received. And what he had was still little: 2 pairs of worn-out boots, patched clothes, a mattress on planks in a small room in the back of Paul's house. But there was something he carried in abundance: dignity. The months passed with ease. George found the good silence again, the kind that doesn't hurt. He slept better, ate with joy, walked without hurry. Slowly, he felt whole again. One day, sitting under the shade of a tree, he looked at the field in front of him and thought, "I know what I need to do." Returning home was not an act of surrender, but a decision. He needed to settle things, organize what was his, and make clear where his story ended. He said goodbye to Paul with a tight hug. "You know this house is yours too," Paul said. "I know. That's why I'm coming back lighter." James helped with the suitcase, and in the farewell, George said, "I'm going to settle some things, but we'll see each other again." "I hope so," James said, his eyes firm. Back in the city, George didn't announce anything. He just resumed his routine as if he'd gone to the market and come back the same day. Carol pretended to be surprised. Ryan didn't even comment, but he was different now. Quiet as always, but now with a purpose. He began to review documents, organized files, and sought out a lawyer. He scheduled the change of the will without telling anyone. When he sat at the notary's office, he made the changes he had been silently maturing. He detailed every decision with clarity and firmness, without hesitation. He registered everything as it should be, on official papers with witnesses. The new version of the will was ready there in front of him, but nothing was revealed. Not a word about the contents left the room. It would only be read after his death, as he wished. Carol and Ryan would continue living as they always had, unaware that the fate of what they thought was guaranteed had already changed. When he finished signing the papers, he felt a relief he hadn't known in a long time. It was as if he had finally protected everything he had built, not from time, but from ingratitude. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about honor, about meaning. And there, alone in front of a clerk who had no idea the weight of that act, George knew his legacy was secure, not in figures, but in the gesture. In the years that followed the silent change at the notary's office, George continued living, but in a different way. He was physically present, but emotionally distant. The house where he had once tried to teach lessons of humility was now just a place of passage. He went back to the city from time to time. He solved what he needed to, visited the old places, left some money, and then left again for Paul's farm. It was there he breathed, where time made sense, and where his presence was more than tolerated. It was welcomed. He spent most of the days by James's side, helping as much as he could, walking slowly along the dirt trails, listening to the sounds of nature that replaced the cutting silences in his daughter's house. Carol and Ryan, even without understanding the reason for his increasingly long absences, didn't care. They only calculated with each return how much longer he would last. They spoke to him in a dry, cold manner, as if tolerating an old guest who still hadn't decided to leave. George saw everything. Nothing surprised him anymore. He received the impatient glances with the same tranquility with which he received the rain on Paul's porch. He knew the lesson would come, and it would be harsh. At the farm, the days had another color. James and Paul were now his family by choice. They had lunch together, laughed at past stories, exchanged ideas about harvest, mechanics, politics, even the future. James had become an attentive, respectful man and kept listening to everything George said with attentive, sincere eyes. Paul, always quiet at the right times, was a silent but firm advisor. Between the two, George felt part of something that was worth it. It was on a calm afternoon, sitting under a tree with wide shade, that George felt his body tire in a different way. It was as if something was telling him that the time to leave was near. He wasn't afraid, not sad. He simply accepted it. He slept peacefully that night, and the next morning, he didn't wake up. The news spread quickly through the city. Paul called Carol, his voice firm but contained. "Your father is gone," he said. "He went in peace, just as he wanted." Carol took a while to answer. She swallowed hard, but tried to keep her voice neutral. "Will you bring the body?" "It's already being taken care of," Paul replied, "and his lawyer will call everyone for the will reading." At the wake, Carol stayed standing next to the coffin, but without shedding a tear. Ryan showed up at the end of the ceremony, his gaze lost. Paul and James remained silent, close by, observing from afar. Their presence bothered Carol. They didn't speak, but they were there with a mourning she didn't understand or didn't want to understand. A few days later, everyone gathered in the lawyer's office, a small room with old furniture, where the air seemed heavy even with the windows open. Carol arrived dressed with rehearsed sobriety, Ryan by her side, impatient. Paul entered silently. James looked nervous but firm. The lawyer began with the formalities. He opened the sealed envelope, flipped through the papers, and after clearing his throat, began reading. "I leave to my daughter, Carol, an amount sufficient for her to not starve in the next few months. This is not for punishment, but for understanding. Those who confuse comfort with entitlement need to relearn the value of things. Let this value not be in inheritance, but in future choices." Carol turned pale. Ryan quickly turned his face, unable to hide his frustration. He tried to say something but swallowed his words. The lawyer continued, "I leave to my friend Paul a significant portion of my belongings, in recognition of the friendship that never expected anything in return, and the dignity with which he lived, even when everything was lacking." Paul closed his eyes for a second, as if silently thanking. "And I leave the majority of my inheritance to James, not by blood, but by honor. For his kindness, for his listening, for the company that healed my soul in the time I had left, let this help serve for the land he so dreams of and for the studies he desires. He never called me useless. He called me Sir." James lowered his head, his eyes full. Paul placed a hand on his shoulder. The lawyer made the final pause. "The rest will be donated to institutions that care for children and the elderly. Those who, like I once was, are forgotten while alive." The room fell silent. Carol couldn't hide her shock. She tried to disguise her disappointment, straightening her shoulders, tightening her lips. Ryan hit the back of the chair and abruptly stood up. "This is your fault," he yelled at his mother. "You ruined everything. You thought he would die like a dog. Now we have nothing." "Don't speak to me like that!" Carol yelled back, losing control of her voice. "You never listened to him. You only wanted the money. And you, what did you do besides waiting?" The lawyer stood up, interrupting politely. "Ma'am, sirs, this is a delicate moment. Please." Ryan stormed out of the room, slamming the door. Carol stayed behind, looking at the floor. She didn't cry, but her face was tense, almost rigid. Paul said goodbye with a brief nod. James remained seated, silent. When they left, James took a deep breath. Outside, the sun touched the sidewalks of the city with a light that made everything seem lighter. He walked to the square, where he used to sit with George when they came to settle something together. He sat on the same bench as always, took from his pocket an old chain with a medal George had given him shortly before he died. "Thank you, sir," James whispered. "You were never a useless old man." In the months that followed, James used what he received to buy his own piece of land. A simple place, but his. He enrolled in a technical agriculture course with classes on weekends. He continued helping when he could, caring for the land with the same care he treated George's words. He didn't become rich, but he became whole. And he never stopped speaking of the old man who taught him more with silence than many teach with shouts. Carol and Ryan, in turn, followed opposite paths. The break was inevitable. There was nothing left to unite them except resentment. The money Carol received didn't last long. She tried for a time to contest the will, but nothing could be reversed. What she had slipped through her fingers, and what she never had, she didn't know how to seek. In the end, the lesson came, not with anger, nor with revenge, but because even the purest heart one day needs to say enough. And when it does, it says it in silence. And silence, sometimes, is the heaviest inheritance of all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.